Hi, welcome everyone. Hi, thank you so much for coming to our session. I'm Calista Small. I'm moderating this session on fostering economic connectedness and action for community leaders. I know there are lots of really interesting sessions happening right now, so thank you so much for coming. So I am a research manager at an organization called More in Common. More in Common is an international research and civic nonprofit whose mission it is to understand the forces driving societies apart, help find common ground, and bring people together to tackle shared challenges. And as a research manager, I conduct qualitative and quantitative studies on a range of topics related to social cohesion and division, specifically in the United States. And I have spent the past 2 years studying social connection, specifically connecting across lines of difference, one of those lines of difference being economic difference, which is why I am here moderating this panel. So I'll be speaking a little bit to the research that we have done. I've passed around our report for you as well throughout this panel, but I am also here with two truly phenomenal humans, so I'm very excited to introduce them. The first is David J. David works at the intersection of social movements and technology. So from founding the Asexual Visibility and Education Network to working in the heart of the tech reform movement, David has centered the work of building relationship as a tool of healing and driving social change. He is the author of the book Relationality, which I love. I'm a huge advocate of this book. Please read this book. It's so good. Okay. He is the author of the book Relationality and has thought extensively about how to define and measure relationships. He also has an interest in movement history, which we'll be hearing about more today. And also here with us is Kelsey Ensign. Kelsey is did I say your name right? You got it right. Perfect. Great. Kelsey is a policy fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She supports the program's democracy and economy projects, including leading the Academy's Economic Connectedness Initiative and a new project on affordable housing. So they're truly two fantastic humans. I'm actually going to turn to them now and have them introduce themselves, talk a little bit about how you got to where you are today, why you're focused on economic connectedness, and I have a fun new question, which is also so that we can get to know you a little bit better. What food reminds you the most of home? So you can take a while to...
David J, he, him pronouns. I have a deep love of matzo ball soup. I've been making my own matzo ball soup from scratch, but I have to say waffles. My dad would make waffles every morning, every Sunday morning when I was growing up. And then when I bought my own house, I'm part of a 3-parent family, so I was invited to co-parent with 2 romantic partners of mine. And when we established a family, I was like, I'm gonna make waffles. And so I got a waffle iron. And then when I wanted to find a way to bring my community together on a regular basis, I said, I'm gonna have a monthly waffles brunch. And so I started bringing everyone, and waffles are great, they're cheap, they feed a lot of people. I got started in this work because I was told growing up as an asexual person that I was gonna be alone forever. And I really want to push back against that story. And I started a website, at first just to find people like me. And that website became the central gathering point for people who identify as asexual, demisexual, and gray around the world. And it has been for the past 25 years. We passed laws, we got delisted as a mental disorder, we host conferences around the world. We do it on a budget of about $3,500 a year, which is what it takes to keep a website up and running. And seeing this like international groundswell of grassroots action, I said, oh, if there are people who are lonely, I can invite them into connection. That connection leads to collective care, and that collective care leads to collective power. And that arc from loneliness to power is what I have devoted my life to working on. Because this was happening on the internet, I became really interested in how can this happen on the internet? What are the ways that we show up in connective software that facilitate that? What are the data footprints of that? How do you know that a particular way about to build relationship, a strategy to build relationship is working? And so that has me advising climate movements. It has me advising a wide range of different people building power. And then most of my life is organizing tech workers inside of large social media companies. So all the things we've been saying about the harms of AI, the people inside of those AI companies are getting together outside of work, and they are like talking to regulators, they're putting out public research, they're trying to say, this is what the world needs to know about the tools you have to make these things better. So I organize that work.
Thank you.
Very cool. It's hard to follow. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Ensign. As Calista mentioned, I'm a policy fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's an organization that's based in Boston, Massachusetts, but I live in Nashville, Tennessee, so only a couple of hours from here. And I just want to say first, just wanted to thank Calista so much for all the work she's put into this panel, and thanks so much to the foundation and everyone else for putting this on. It's been really great to connect with so many people. I'll tell more about my kind of personal story and connection with our topic for today a little while later, but I'll just say, because I always think the Academy is a weird place, so I always think anytime I talk about my work, it's just helpful for y'all to know more about this place. The Academy was founded in 1780 by folks like John Adams and John Hancock, so people you've heard of before. And they founded this organization to advance knowledge in all the arts and sciences to strengthen a new and growing democracy. As you may be aware of, we're in an interesting democratic moment today, and that mission remains as true as ever. The Academy is both an honorary membership society, so we have members from Tom Hanks all the way to mathematicians who do things that I will never understand. And we're also an independent research center, so we pull folks from that very impressive membership side and study some of society's most complex problems. And that includes American democracy. It also includes the economy, and I put some of our political economy reports out on the chairs for you guys. One of the recommendations in that report, which was all about studying how do we create an economy that better serves the American people, one of those recommendations was specifically about promoting economic connectedness, or trying to find ways to create relationships across socioeconomic lines. That, if you read that recommendation, that report, it didn't offer a ton of specifics about how to actually do that. And so we formed a follow-up working group. And there's a website that we'll show you in a second that's all about some of the how-tos that we'll get into in just a minute. But and my food. I have a lot of them, but my mom is from New Jersey, grew up in an Italian household, and she makes the most incredible spaghetti sauce. And it was always just a staple in our home, to the point where my friends used to say that our house just literally always smelled like spaghetti sauce. It's not something I've ever been able to replicate, I wish, but so I always have to go home to get that touch of hometown food.
Thank you. Okay, so now that you know us, I would like everyone to turn to someone in the room, and we're going to get to know each other a little bit better as well. Same question for you all. What food reminds you the most of home? And then also, why are you here? How does connection across lines of socioeconomic status show up in your work, if at all? Maybe you're just curious about it. And what are you excited to learn about this topic? I think it's important to think about this now, because if there's anything you don't say during the conversation, you can ask at the end. So we're going to do this for about 10 minutes. Does everyone have a person?
Yeah.
That was so easy. Thank you so much. I hope everyone had a moment to talk about their food. We were talking about our foods. My favorite food, I'm from Los Angeles, from Southern California, is peaches. And I think that the peaches in California are better than the peaches in Georgia. So it is. It's true. My favorite, the food that reminds me the most of home, I'm from Southern California. I grew up in Los Angeles. It's actually peaches. And I really think that the peaches in Southern California are better than just though. I know I'm crazy. Yeah, basically. About these questions. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our panelists here. So I wanted to ground us in some research and some history. So you've both studied social connection extensively in your work. My question is, so why now? Why talk about economic connectedness in this and focus on strengthening relationships across lines of socioeconomic difference in this social and political moment that we're in?
Sure, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, the Academy's economic connectedness work grew out of a larger project and initiative around studying the political economy of our entire country. So really big and thorny questions. And the reason why we included the economic connectedness recommendation in that report was we were really inspired by the research of, I know that his name has been brought up many times today, but Raj Chetty and other folks at Opportunity Insights, whose research really showed how vital economic connectedness or relationships across class lines are to upward mobility, so moving beyond your current economic status. And I will say, I read that report so many different times. I'm not a data nerd in the way that those folks are. I really admire people who are able to think in that way. But I just couldn't fully understand what exactly that meant in practice. And it took me time to realize that, I'm actually a product of this exact concept that they're thinking about. So I'm a poor kid from Tennessee, and I say that intentionally because it took me a long time to be able to come to terms with that identity. I was raised in Chattanooga, just about 2 hours from here. I was raised by a single mom who supported us by working at Olive Garden. I grew up in a low working class neighborhood. Most of my neighborhood friends had also single moms who mainly worked in nail salons or as hairdressers and things of the like. My mom very much wanted us to have a different life path than the one that she was on. And so she fought tooth and nail to get us scholarships to a private college prep school that was a little bit further in than the neighborhood that we grew up in. And I was just really lucky to get to go there. And I was surrounded by people who were just at coming from a completely different economic background than I was. The vast majority of my friends were very wealthy and coming from a completely different life circumstance. And it was just offered me the opportunity to be integrated every day and surrounded by people who were talking about things like their college essay or preparing for the SATs. It also just showed me a different way of living, about what it means to have house parties where you're surrounded by people who are working these really impressive jobs, and what it means to be able to form connections with those folks. And that was just an opportunity those were conversations that I was not having with my friends in the neighborhood that offered me a different kind of lifeline. But all this to say, it's certainly the reason why I went to college, why I ended up in grad school, and why I work at a place like the Academy. So when I say that economic connectedness is important, I think it's just useful to know what that actually looks like, from the human side of things. So all that to say, these relationships really are important for material success. They just open up doors that otherwise might be closed to you. And that means through an exchange of information, resources, contacts. Again, I know that we've heard all these words throughout the day today and yesterday as well, but just gives you access to the social capital that allows you to kind of advance in ways that you might not be able to otherwise. I want to just say too, I think sometimes the ways that we talk about cross-class relationships, we really talk about it from a kind of a unilateral perspective that, if rich kids just bless poor kids with their presence, that's a great thing. I would also say there's just a lot for folks coming from a wealthier background to also learn and gain by having relationships with folks who are coming from a less advantaged perspective. As I mentioned too, the Academy and our work is really focused on questions around democracy and the civic health of our communities and the country as a whole. We all know that we're living in really polarized and politically divided times. A big reason for that is because we are not connecting across these class lines. There's a real, and we saw it especially play out in the election last year. There's a real kind of class resentment and class divide that's playing out in a variety of destructive ways in our politics. And that really finding ways to bridge those divides at the community level in individual relationships is really key to healing some of those divides that are ailing both the civic health of our local communities, but also just the nature and strength of our democracy overall. Talk more about that in a minute, but it's David to give us more context for that.
Oh, thank you so much. And I will just say I've such appreciation and respect for the research that both of your organizations are doing on this important question. I realize I actually forgot to answer one part of this question, so I want to come back to what brings me to why, how does socioeconomic connection show up in my work? And I think, unlike both of you, don't come at it from the angle of economic mobility. I come at it from the angle of movement history. So when we look across history, the movements that have had the most profound systemic change almost always have a cross-class coalition behind them. They also notably almost always have a significant youth-led component. that is intergenerationally supported. But when I look at, the difference between, say, the suffragettes and the animal rights movement, when I look at, I want to talk about primarily about two movements, but there's a few other I might bring in. I want to talk about the suffragettes in the early 20th century. I want to talk about the movement to resist the Vietnam War, both of which built really powerful cross-class coalitions. And a thing I believe is that when we talk about social connection, we talk about community, movements only succeed when they do that powerfully. So if we look at the history of movements that have succeeded, there's some really powerful lessons in how we connect. I think there's also some counterexamples. The movement around breast cancer tried and failed, I think, to build some cross-class coalitions, so there's some exceptions to that. This also is transpartisan, so I think there's some really powerful lessons from the history of the movement for gun rights around how to build cross-class coalition. But I want to tell quickly a story about the suffragettes, a story about the anti-war protesters. So the suffragettes, we think with the suffragette movement is coming into being, and you have a mostly middle and upper class group that is interested in voting rights, and you have a mostly working class group that is interested in political power. They are folks like garment workers. They are not necessarily thinking about political representation, they're thinking about the sexist and classist harm impossibilities that they're living through. And so a few things happen. The first thing that happens is that there are a series of garment worker strikes led by women. And you have middle and upper class people showing up in solidarity with those strikes. So they're invited in. There is some work, some messiness to why middle and upper class people show up to these strikes, what they expect when they show up to these strikes, how they need to learn how the movement being led by working class people operates. And so there are people who sort of do the work of, okay, we're going to help you figure out how to land and find your place here. But them showing up in those strikes helps to build this bridge. And it helps to build this bridge because they're establishing they want to support the power that the garment workers are engaging with. So after that, you see some of these more middle and upper class led suffragette groups hiring people who are organized as the garment strikes as organized as the suffragette movement. So there's a willingness to pay people for their labor. And when those people are hired, they're not just given orders, they are given authority within the movement. They are working often very closely with volunteers who come from more middle and upper class backgrounds, doing similar work, mobilizing people, and meaning that there is a close coordination between how suffragette, between the kinds of tactics that echo things like garment worker strike and the kinds of tactics that sort of come out of more middle and upper class organizing. And that means that the focus of the entire movement shifts to account for cross-class needs. And that also allows the movement, this cross-class movement, to be funded. So another thing I'll share, if you look historically at how really powerful movements are funded, it often is not through philanthropic dollars. Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott were funded through largely grassroots donor organizing in something of a cross-class way in Montgomery, Alabama. So building cross-class movements also is a really powerful way to move funding. The other thing that happened was you had people from middle and upper, mostly women from middle and upper class communities showing up and creating these what we call settlement houses. They would move to working class neighborhoods to engage in social services. This was the foundation of modern social work. And so you have people showing up and then sort of being welcomed, and people from working class communities helping to shape the way they're showing up to make it actually helpful and useful. But those houses, like Hull House, become central sites of organizing for the suffragette movement. There's some really interesting parallels in the movement to resist the Vietnam War. So there you have a coalition, like a group of people who are being drafted, who are pushing back against the draft, and you have a group of people initially in elite universities who are pushing back against the war as a violent colonial power. People from elite universities start first about reaching out to state schools, then intentionally moving off campus to build closer relationships with non-students, then and through that connecting with people who are being drafted and with GIs. And in coalition with GIs, like GIs and students start creating these GI coffee houses. So outside of a base, you'll have a coffee house that's mostly staffed by anti-war students who are volunteers. That's just like a place to hang out and chill. And this is similar to what we see in other classes. It's these places where people are just there to build relationship with one another, primarily, and then secondarily there to build political power. So these coffee houses become a real center of organizing, like a site of organizing. And they're located in a place that's accessible for people, and a place where interesting conversation, power is being built. So I'll pause there if this is going on, but I think there's some really interesting lessons to take from that history, and I have some sources I encourage you all to look into more if you're curious.
Thank you so much for sharing all that amazing information. So now we know why building relationships across lines of socioeconomic status is so important, especially in our social and political moment that we are currently in. So let's talk now about some of the challenges to doing that. So what is getting in the way of forming these connections?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons is that there's just not a ton of, and I mean this, not a lot of natural and easy opportunities for people of different socioeconomic statuses to actually live, play, and work together. Like it takes a lot of work to be able to get even into the same rooms as people who might be coming from a different economic background than you. There's a number of reasons for that. I think for us, one of the most important things to think about is the structural reasons, a mix of policy choices that have allowed for our neighborhoods, our schools, our community infrastructure to be homogenized by both class and racial lines. We're both historians here, so sorry if this is more history than you really need. But obviously a mix of redlining practices of exclusionary zoning have very much isolated wealthy homeowners into pockets of neighborhoods while others are living in a completely different area. Our schools reflect the demographics of the neighborhoods that we live in. And so if you're living in a space primarily surrounded by folks who are wealthy or affluent as you, then your school is going to reflect that as well. And this also just can look the same in different community institutions. So like the gym that you're going to, even the library that you might be going to is going to really reflect the neighborhood makeup of the area that you live. And so if it's a homogenous area, then that's just, again, those are the people that just naturally you're going to be interacting with. It's also, in addition to those policy choices, it's also a mix of individual choices as well. Plenty of wealthy Americans in particular have declined from public spaces over the past few decades, really, and there's been a real decline in public spaces that are actually offer room for interaction across class lines. So less public pools, less public and actually diverse along economic lines, sports leagues, because a lot of wealthy families are putting their kids into even like private soccer leagues rather than just bringing their kids to the Y, where they might be. It might be cheaper and just easier to interact with people who look different than you. So again, all that just adds up to it being really hard. Like you have to be really intentional, no matter what line of the spectrum that you fall on, if you want and are interested in trying to interact with people who look different than you. And from the practitioner side, that means it requires a lot of strategic thinking about both the place that you're in and also the kind of programming that you're offering to try to offer the space that can bring people together across class lines. And even in places that are actually economically integrated on paper, that in no way means that these relationships are just naturally forming. It's really hard work to get people together in the same space, and it's even harder work to actually get those folks to interact in a way that develops natural relationships. And Calista's really great recent research can tell y'all more about the whys and what's a bad aspect of it.
So I'll coming back to my research, which I will admit I did for this panel. Most of my life is researching kind of adjacent questions to this, so I'm not as in depth as this as I am in many things in my book. But one of the themes that comes up in my book is the ways in which the experience of class privilege in the Western world is often very socially isolating. That it is sort of a world that's optimized for transaction, and so people can lose touch with relationship. And one of the themes that I see in both the history of the suffragette movement and the history of the Vietnam War movement and a number of other cross-class coalitions is that there are people who are motivated to engage in the movement because they want out of the isolation of wealth culture. And cross-class movements are providing them with like a needed personal thing that sometimes gets covered up by a narrative of charity or sometimes gets covered up by a narrative of something else, but that's a strong personal motivator. And so creating spaces where people can build relationships where their identity is not tied to their class status, I think can be incredibly liberating and can be really hard to do. And there's a lot of ways that causes people to show up in ways that are problematic, that need to sort of be managed. So I think that's one challenge, is like meeting that motivation and then helping people kind of get in good relationship with it. I also know a little bit from some of the work and some of what I've studied that cross-class places can be very dangerous. Like they can be scary. There can be consequences, especially people without a lot of power and privilege, just showing up in them. Negative consequences potentially because they're in the room with power structures that are scary if they target you. And so figuring out how to build a sense of safety, figuring out how to create an environment that that understands those risks and how to construct and manage them and understands the ways that people may show up with their power or with their lack of power in ways that would make it difficult to connect. I think that's that's one of the significant challenges.
And thank you so much for sharing. That's a perfect segue. So I asked this question. I also have an answer that I wanted to share as well. So part of the study that I passed around is we asked 6,000 U.S. adults basically if they were interested in forming connections across lines of difference. Because as Tulsi mentioned, we see wealthy individuals, for example, taking their kids and putting them in the expensive soccer leagues, etc. So it's like, are people actually interested in forming these connections? And I'm just going to present a little bit of data on this. Okay. So we asked people who come from a higher socioeconomic status if they're interested in connecting and doing these activities with people from a lower socioeconomic status. And then we asked people from a lower socioeconomic status, are you interested in connecting with people from a higher socioeconomic status? And on average, this is on average, you can see that everybody's generally interested in it, or at least they say that they're interested in it on the survey. However, people from a lower socioeconomic status express less interest. And so we were really interested in that as researchers. And we were like, well, why is that? So we asked a whole bunch of follow-up questions. And two main themes emerged, which gets to the point that you were talking about. The first is one of affordability. They're like, well, I can't interact with people from a higher socioeconomic status because I literally can't afford what they do. I can't afford to go skiing, so I'm not going to hang out with them. The second thing that emerged is a sense of insecurity and worry about feeling misunderstood or not respected. People said, they were like, I don't want to interact with someone who's wealthier than me because they do not understand my life experiences and they won't respect me, so I'm not going to do it. And so addressing those concerns and those feelings is going to be really important for organizations who are interested in forming meaningful connections across lines of difference. Yeah, so that was a challenge that we identified. I'm just going to leave this data up because that's why not. So we just talked through some of the challenges, and now we're going to talk about solutions. So can you speak to some solutions and give some examples of specific organizations that are working effectively to build economic connectedness?
Yeah, so I should just say on the website that we'll share in just a second, we collected a number of everyone's favorite thing, case studies, but I love a good case study. I think it could be really informative. And we were just trying to analyze what made these different communities and programs and institutions, why were they effective at actually bridging these socioeconomic divides and fostering cross-class relationships. And what we found is that really economic connectedness requires two conditions. Again, one is just proximity. So literally on paper that there are people coming to your institution, your school, your YMCA, that there are folks coming who are coming from different economic backgrounds. Two, it requires meaningful interaction. So it's not just one-off, like I see you on the sidewalk at a farmer's market once. No, it really requires sustained and meaningful engagement where you're actually having opportunities to really get to know one another and form. It doesn't have to be a lasting relationship. It can be a casual one, but then at least you're kind of breaking down some of those barriers and actually getting to know one another. So that looks like a regular pickup game of basketball at the YMCA or a storytelling hour at the library every Saturday. It's these kind of sustained, routine, regular environments where you're actually getting to interact with people and get to know them. It's what one of our working group members called activating the mix, which I just really like that phrase of that. You actually have people who are together in one space that are coming from different backgrounds, but they're actually, it's not just the mix itself. It has to be activated in some way. And that's, again, where practitioners have to do the real work of trying to figure out ways to overcome some of the barriers that both Calista and David were talking about. And that requires a couple of different things. So, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to read these because otherwise I'm going to forget them all. But one, it requires actual investment. And I really loved Kevin, right? Okay, great. Sorry. Kevin's panel earlier where they talked about really investing in local governments and other environments that are actually really bringing people together. We had a case study, and I think another panel that I went to mentioned Spartanburg, South Carolina. They've done a lot of really incredible work intentionally building a mixed income neighborhood and accompanying elementary school. I think there's also a YMCA involved there. But again, like actually fostering a neighborhood, a place where people are living together, working together, playing together, and just, again, leave some more natural ways for people to form relationships across class lines. It also, if you're, someone who's offering different programs to people, to Calista's point, and sorry, I also to Dick Toyer, you need to create attractive programming that is available and accessible to people across all class lines. So again, if you're a local librarian and you're having you might be offering food or childcare, if you're hosting some kind of community conversation that you want people to be coming together from across class lines. I think to us, and this again just makes intuitive sense if you think for yourself, well, how did I form relationships, or who are the people in my life who I have lasting friendships with? Often you've connected through some kind of common interests or shared goal. A lot of my friends that I still keep up with from home are people who I ran with on our track team. Like having those kinds of things where you're connected with one another through some kind of shared purpose. And one of our case studies is a really interesting rowing program, which, sorry, I don't really know anything about rowing. For if anybody in the room knows a lot about it, but they did a lot of interesting thinking about, obviously, rowing. Again, from what I know, from what I've heard, is not exactly the most accessible sport in the world. But in Boston, they had, at this rowing program, had different programs for folks who were coming from kind of the wealthier, more affluent neighborhoods in Boston, and then grant-funded programs for kids who were coming from inner city Boston. They had those as two kind of separate programs. Ted, the man who runs Community Rowing Inc. there, he was like, why are we having these as separate entities? Like, we literally should just put these kids together in the same boat. So they're literally rowing together, having that same experience, and having a real opportunity to actually get to know one another. So again, it doesn't even necessarily take, it's just a slight adjustment to your thinking about how can we actually even take the people that we have together here and actually get them together in one space. Requires having trained brokers, again, to navigate some of those complicated relationships that just naturally arise when you're dealing with people who are coming from different backgrounds. And then it also, again, this came up a lot in the panel that I went to earlier, a lot, just if there's one main word, is being really intentional, creating cross-class connections and relationships as a primary goal of your institution for your program. The Richard King Mellon Foundation, for example, in Pennsylvania, intentionally funded or put out an RFP for institutions that were fostering these connections. that just require people who wanted that money to think about how they were doing that.
Where was this?
This is in Pennsylvania. Yeah. There's a teacher in Palo Alto, California, who read Raj Chetty's work and was just really inspired by it. And she was teaching at a school that's primarily, Silicon Valley folks, so not a relatively affluent school. There's about, I think, 15% or so of the students were coming from lower income backgrounds, but they were often in different tracks in their school, as what often happens. And again, she's tried to really think about, well, how can I, as a teacher of AP English, how can I get these folks together and not just in one classroom, but actually use my tools as a teacher to have them get to know one another. So she created a mentorship program where all students were able to kind of share and learn from one another. So again, it just requires some real intentionality to foster these environments that lead to these connections. And I really encourage y'all to just glance through these case studies because they're really inspiring.
Amazing. I'd say a few things that come from sort of looking at trends in the movements I talked about, and a few other ones. One is that privileged folks drive. So the spaces where these connections are happening are more convenient and more comfortable for less privileged folks, in part because there's higher motivation for more privileged folks to get there, and in part because it's easier to create a space where everyone feels safe, that is like culturally familiar to folks with less privilege. A second is that there should be a willingness there's a need for the program to be run and governed by a cross-class coalition. It can't just be a sort of professionalized middle and upper class staff. And that may involve, and we see this in multiple movements and it's tricky, I know in my world too, that may involve paid folks and volunteers working next to one another, doing very similar work, depending on their class background and what kind of support they need to be able to do the work, because volunteering itself is a thing that requires privilege. A third is that some of the most powerful forms of connection happen in formal social space. So something we were talking about earlier is the power of after spaces. It's like you get together, you do a thing, and then there's like food and coffee, maybe beer, maybe whatever afterward. Like that's where the real work happens. And across movement history, we see a lot of, and lots of really powerful stories of this in the Montgomery bus boycott. The spaces where people connect, often around music, often around food, often after what we think of as the meeting or the rally or whatever else, that was where the real power was built. That seems to also hold true for this kind of organizing. And the last thing I want to emphasize, which shows up again and again and again in my work on movements, is the power of collective care. So quick story I'll tell about the Montgomery bus boycott. We think of it as this powerful moment in the civil rights movement, but it comes out of churches, and it comes out of churches where people are caring for one another. And if you think about what the action was that built power, it was giving people rides to work. It was bringing food to people who had a hard time shopping. It was providing childcare. Like it was we know how to show up and support one another that got built up through the church, that allowed for this opting out of infrastructure they wanted to change. And so there's ways that foundation of collective care shows up again and again and again when we look at how movements build really long-term power. And so thinking about how, how's childcare happening in these spaces? How's food and cleanup happening in these spaces? Like those are really important questions to explore and potential sites of relationship and power to be built.
Thank you. That's really just, I'm so inspired. I know that we already discussed all this, but I just love hearing about all these incredible solutions. Okay. How much time do we have?
You've got 20 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. We're going to talk for about 10 more minutes and we'll open up for a Q&A. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can improve as a field. So I have two kind of meaty questions, which I'm excited about. So we've talked about solutions, and we know that connection is messy. It's not straightforward. And I want to talk through some of those more complicated aspects of this type of connection. So research shows that we know that certain lower socioeconomic status groups already lack a lot of connection. So research is out there that shows that men without a college degree are some of the least connected people in the United States. They are lacking friendships, they're lacking connections to institutions, they're lacking romantic relationships comparatively to other people. So this is a really important and hard to reach group. And if we're talking about connecting across lines of difference, if this group is already so hard to reach, how are we going to make sure that we're not letting them continue to fall through the cracks? So do we have any ideas for strategies for how to reach both? We could talk about men without college degrees, but other groups as well.
I've got a great example for this.
Great.
Project I'm advising around impact measurement. And I think this is the principle of you go to where people are. So there's a really interesting, are any of you familiar with the group Equimundo? So there's an interesting partnership with Equimundo, a few other groups, and Discord, which is like, it's kind of like Slack, but it's mostly used for like people talk about video games. So they are doing an intervention on Discord around relational skill building in gamer communities. So there's a community of people, there's a game, a whole universe called Warhammer 40K, which is like it's like all about like war, and it's got a lot of masculinity stuff in it that's questionable. And there's a big video game that takes place in this universe, and so they've moved in, and they are in universe. There are these like space marines who are kind of medics, and they go around and they like give people med packs when they are in battle. So they have people who role play the medics who do mental health and relational skill building interventions with other people in the community. And they figured out how to sort of code those all to be in the world that like in the world and in the comfortable language of this group of mostly men who are mostly getting online to mostly play a video game and who are having, social conflict and emotional health stuff come up. And so they've figured out, they're like doing all of this work with like guided by the leaders in that community to figure out how, like, what's the community's goals for how they want to be more socially, emotionally healthy, and then how do they meet it in this way that's very in the community's own terms.
That's an amazing example. That is so cool. Yeah. Do you have anything you'd like to add? And if
Yeah, I mean, that was amazing. I think again, this is not like a specific thing, but I think as much as possible, removing kind of the social engineering or making it, even if you are kind of doing that, because again, you're trying to be intentional about creating these opportunities for relationships, making it not be work for folks to come be together in one space and actually form these relationships. To David's point, meet people where they are, offer things that they would actually just want to do on their own, but you're providing them with the opportunities and conditions that would lead to these kinds of relationships.
Wonderful. Thank you. So my last question, we already talked a bit about power and these dynamics. So obviously in these relationships, people are coming from a different powerful background. So people who are from a higher socioeconomic status have more power in society. People from a lower socioeconomic status don't. And that's going to affect the relationship. These relationships could turn exploitive, where a high status person expects more of the lower status person. They can't get out of the relationship. There may be issues related to politics. Maybe the low status person wants to change the status quo. Maybe the high status individual doesn't, or honestly, vice versa. How do we address it? Now, these are like, we're talking hypothetically here, but if you have any specific examples, how do we address these power dynamics in these relationships that presumably also define the relationship while also fostering meaningful, healthy connection? So just a really easy question.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's really important to have people who are literally trained in how to navigate these conversations or really opportunities for connection that can get contentious, or might just be able to really, understand and offer ways for folks to be able to overcome those divides rather than have them be sticking points. I mentioned this earlier, but I do think, I think there's even something in the way that we talk about it and ensuring that we are creating opportunities for people on all sides of the economic spectrum to gain something from one another. So it's not just, again, here I am as a person of a lower economic status and I get to I'm blessed by being surrounded by folks who have more than me and can share, their connections and resources and information with me. I think, again, there's so much that people can learn from all sides of the spectrum from each other. One of our case studies is of the American Exchange Project, which is basically like a internal study abroad. So like if you're from rural Mississippi, you might spend a month of your summer in New York City and vice versa. And one of the examples that I loved, or one of the stories I love from that project, was somebody from Silicon Valley. He ended up in, I think it was South Dakota, and he ended up changing his entire career path as he was working in the kitchen with the host family that he lived with in South Dakota, and just realized like that's what he wanted to do, and he didn't need to go to college to do that in the way that he was kind of being pressured to do. So again, everyone's horizons can be broadened by having access to these new environments and relationships.
I think about some of the ways that people can be supported in the work that, like personal work that they need to do around this. One example, and I've seen this play out in a number of different movement space I've been in, is money story exercises. Is this something you're familiar with?
No, I don't know about that.
So it's a facilitated conversation when people sit down and talk about their personal history with money.
Wow.
Where did the money in their life come from or not come from? Like if they come from history where money was taken away, what was that history? If they come from history where money flowed to them, what was that history? What are the ways they relate to that? What are the lessons they learned about money growing up? What were the things they were encouraged to talk about and not talk about when it came to money? And that can be helpful to unpack across class backgrounds a lot of shame
Yeah.
that people have. And it can get people to a place where they can be comfortable naming things that shame may otherwise prevent them from naming. And where they've like explicitly thought of stories that named, excavated, gotten support on stories that they may otherwise have a difficult, would otherwise kind of cause them to freeze up. Mm-hmm. And I think of exercises like that as a powerful way to sort of help people do some of the work that they need, especially when they're motivated to show up in one of these spaces and are nervous about how to do it.
Those are incredible examples. Thank you. Can we please thank our brilliant panel? I'm so inspired. There is some, before we get into a Q&A, I just wanted to pull up some QR codes because we have so many resources. This is a session about action, right? So we got resources on resources. So we actually put together a really short guide combining the research that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences did on these case studies with more in commons research from the Connection Opportunity. It's just 2 pages. So if you want a 2-page summary, that's there. And then I'm gonna now change the slide. We can also go back to this one. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences has a whole website that's even more comprehensive and amazing that talks about the research and behind all this work and all the work that they're doing. And then also, please, this book is so brilliant.
I have a few copies I'm happy to sign for anyone if you want one.
Yes, it's really amazing. And we didn't get a chance to talk about this today, but David did an incredible job thinking about how to measure these types of relationships to be able to advocate for funding for them.
And I'm doing a couple practical projects around that too that I'd be happy to share learnings from if anyone's curious.
Yes. So please read this book. It's very, very good. Okay, I'm going to leave this up and we have some time for questions. Yes.
So fantastic. Great conversation. And I want to say one thing about something Kelsey said and then ask you a question. So first, I agree that often the repetition of events or projects can be important for establishing relationships, but I also want to put it out there that that also is something that can be difficult for people in low income situations to go to something again and again. Mm-hmm. Scheduling is really hard if you're juggling multiple jobs or so. Sometimes a single event that's really intentional and really creates meaningful connection to people can be just as powerful as going and create a situation where when people do see each other later in the community at the farmer's market or at the grocery store, then they've established a relationship that then can build on, or friendships that can be built. So sometimes a single meaningful event can be just as good as something, I think, that repeats. And then I was wondering, just on person, and you can decline to do this if you like, but I really appreciated first you sharing personally your story of economic, growing up, and what you said about it not being unilateral. I'm wondering if you would reflect on some ways that you think you're connecting with other teens with higher wealth impacted them, rather than just, I think you kind of just presented some things like SATs and stuff like that impacted you, but I'd love for you to reflect on the inverse of that, of like how you impacted that.
Yeah, no, I love, or that first of all, thanks so much for saying that first point. That's completely true. The only distinction I was trying to make is like if you're just like riding on the subway with somebody, like that's a different thing than actually having like a one sustained, even if it was one event that has a sustained or like again longer than like just a hi hello situation where you're actually getting the time to know one another. But totally agree with you that it's hard to have like kind of scheduled repeat event. It's important to have those other opportunities as well. Yeah, so these are things that I've only really kind of learned recently from now like really being intentional and thinking about this more in my life and just connecting with my friends my friends from high school who it's not like at the time I would have known or had been thinking about this. And it, to David and Calissa's point, like these were kind of like strange conversations to guess bring up later about, because we didn't really talk about money or anything. It was just like something that was there. But in doing this work, I just I did ask them this question because I was just curious. Like if I knew what I had gained from having these folks in my life, I was curious if they had felt as if they had gained, or obviously we're friends. So it's yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. And I was the only one in my friend group who had to work, and so what one of my best friend from home, Emily, who was raised by a surgeon, really privileged, beautiful life. And she said there was just a value in watching somebody who actually knew what the value of a dollar was and actually had to work, had to go to work after school and had to work on the weekends and work over the summer. It was like an eye-opening experience for her. And being able to come to my neighborhood and see and just interact with people who were really different from her kind of very privileged suburban mountain life that she was living. I just think there was something about seeing a different way of living. And it was more, I think, again, just kind of an eye-opening experience for her, that when she moved through the world, she knew that there were other people who had struggles. So when she eventually was an adult and had to like now actually think about those things, she was like, I've seen this before. I understand what this might look like. So yeah. I'm sure there's other ways and other reasons, but that's
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. You have 5 minutes left. Yes, Eric.
Hello. Thank you both, and Walter. Really so for a helpful resource. The question I had is about movements and then economic self-interest and the challenges. What came to mind as we're talking about these examples, especially David, is I'm from Boston, and in the late '60s there was a very powerful, impactful micro movement to prevent highways bulldozing through communities. And because it was across wealth, race, class lines, it was beautiful and powerful how communities came together and resisted and stopped these highways from being built. And I live near one where the highway just ends because you Cambridge, and it's just, it dumps into Cambridge and you can't get on the highway any further. 5 years later, there's mandated school desegregation in Boston, and the city explodes, and some of these same communities that had been coming together to prevent bulldozing highways are now at each other's throats. And the reputation, and deservedly so, of Boston being this racist city came a few years after this like cross-racial movement, where you have these like competing economic self-interests, and how now today like NIMBY and YIMBYism of people who have certain values, or when it then merges into specific like fear or so, my economic self-interest about the value of my home or something, just completely diverges people's actions. I see that we start in an underrepresented, marginalized, oppressed community and build output from there, and yet then it seems to reach a pushback point. I'm curious how we can overcome that.
I mean, I think this is, and I feel like I scratched the surface of this story, but I think the suffragettes are especially interesting because there was significant pushback against the suffragette, against having equal voting or having giving women vote or having women be able to vote among upper class women because there was a fear of a swell of political power if more working class people were given the vote. So there was a tension. There was a sort of economic tension there, and when it came to supporting labor strikes, there's a lot of tension among middle and upper class folks, including within the movement. So the economic self-interest and the sort of like the social pressure of the economic interests of your upper class friends being challenged by the movement that you're part of was a source of tension. And we see sometimes where that kind of wins out. And I think sometimes where there can be successful pushback against that. And so to me, the interesting thing is like, when is the norm of economic self-interest shutting down these coalitions? Like, when is that broken? And what is the pre-work that took to break through that?
Maybe one more question. Yes, hi. I don't see your name.
20. Okay. And yeah, I'll set up my Venmo for it. Happy to send a copy for you. If I run out, it's also, you can get it anywhere. It's also an audiobook. It'll be $20 there too. So
it's really beautifully written. Anything else? Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much. I love this conversation about any kind of like box connectedness, cross consciousness, because it's so vital. But much of this seems to be like an urban planning issue, especially talking about like mixed use living where people are able to live, work, and play in the same spaces. And I feel like now we're seeing like major developments in the downtown, and then Whole Foods is going in, but the people who work at the Whole Foods cannot live the same place they're working. Maybe more of a comment than a question, or just like you see or any specific policy change or ways that people who are not urban planners can advocate for the mixed living.
just I will say quickly, a thread that I did not realize was so strong until I started the research for this panel, and now I want to pull it more, is how much movements that have been successful at building cross-class power have had a thread of intentionally mixed income, like going out of their way to create housing arrangements like that. That's a really interesting thread in movement history, and I want to see how it shows up in other movements. But just that there's evidence of how powerful that is.
And I was going to say, this is less an answer to your question and more a plugging of a new project that the Academy is working on, which is about affordable housing, but in particular about how anchor institutions and communities, so especially universities and colleges, but also place-based philanthropies and faith-based institutions, how can they use their land holdings, especially, again, so many higher education institutions end up pushing people out as they develop further, as they build their new fitness centers and other things they need to be attractive to college-age kids now, and end up displacing a number of residents who've been in those places for a long time. So we're working on trying to figure out how do we build a coalition of institutions who want to be on the reverse side of that and actually build out land or use their land holdings and buildings to actually build affordable housing that keeps folks in the community, including their employees and their work staff, both like adjunct professors, but also cleaning staff and other folks like that. So that's not a real answer to your question, but I'll say it's an important question and something that we're thinking on as we move forward. Hans.
It's the end of our session. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you. It's like our panelists. They're really
Hey, thank you so much.
Please keep talking to us. Let's keep the conversation going and enjoy the rest of the event.